It begins, as many strange tales do, in the silence of a night when most of the world is asleep. The year was 1883, and in the Portuguese coastal town of Setúbal, death was no stranger. Funerals were frequent, mourning clothes a common sight, and the toll of church bells had become a rhythm the townspeople could not escape. Yet even in a place accustomed to sorrow, there emerged a sound that unsettled the living more deeply than the clatter of coffins or the cries of mourners. It was a sound that seemed to belong to the other side. According to the earliest accounts, the phenomenon began without warning. On an evening in late spring, just as the town's lamps guttered out and the last of the fishermen tied their boats at harbor, a widow walking past the cemetery swore she heard a song. Not a song as one might hear from a passing tavern, nor the rough chant of sailors, but a solemn harmony, precise and deliberate, rising from the ground itself. Voices, men's voices, singing in unison, low and mournful, as though rehearsed in secret. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to locate the source. But when she peered through the iron gates, the graveyard was empty. The story might have ended there, dismissed as grief's invention, had not others come forward in the nights that followed. Within days, whispers spread through Setúbal that a choir of unseen singers appeared at midnight. Always at midnight. They sang as the town held its breath, their Latin hymns weaving through the damp mist that rolled in from the Atlantic. The songs were not loud. They did not crash like a storm or pierce the air like cries of agony. Rather, they floated, steady and composed, with a strange clarity that made each listener swear the voices were meant for them alone. Descriptions of the sound shared a chilling consistency. Some said the choir resembled monks chanting within stone cloisters, their notes rising and falling like waves. Others insisted the music was far too refined for peasants or priests, that it resembled the trained harmonies of cathedral choristers. But all agreed on one point: there were no singers to be seen. Those who searched the cemetery grounds by lantern found only gravestones, weeds, and the restless whisper of the wind. When the final note faded, silence reigned again, until the following midnight, when the cycle repeated. Imagine, for a moment, the setting in which this took place. Setúbal in the 1880s was not the bustling fishing hub it would later become. Its streets were narrow, cobbled, and poorly lit, its houses small and pressed tightly together. The town's cemetery lay just beyond the church of São Julião, its gates wrought iron and its walls streaked with salt from the sea air. At night, the fog rolled in thick, smothering lamp glow and making every footstep echo twice as loud. It was a place where shadows seemed to multiply, and where the presence of death lingered in the air as tangibly as the scent of brine and smoke. It was here, against this backdrop, that the first listeners stood transfixed. To them, the voices were not mere sound. They were a presence. A widow clasped her rosary so tightly that the beads cut her skin, swearing she could hear the choir sing the words of the Requiem, Lux aeterna lucidis. Eternal light shine upon them. A fisherman crossing the square froze as the music curled above him, unable to decide whether it drifted from heaven or from the soil beneath his boots. The effect was not one of chaos or terror, not at first. There was, in fact, something mesmerizing in the order of the voices. They sang with neither haste nor passion, but with the calm solemnity of a ritual endlessly repeated. If fear entered the hearts of those who listened, it was not the shrieking fear of nightmares, but a slower, colder unease, the realization that they were hearing what should not exist. For the most devout Catholics, the sound could be interpreted as angelic. Surely, they reasoned, no devil would sing prayers for the dead. And yet others muttered darkly that demons were cunning, and that the beauty of the music might only be a mask. The ambiguity, the refusal of the phenomenon to declare itself as either holy or unholy, was perhaps what unsettled listeners most. If it had been terrible, they could have rejected it. If it had been miraculous, they could have embraced it. But what are mortals to do with a mystery that offers no certainty? Night after night, the pattern repeated. The town clock would strike 12, and the notes would swell, weaving into harmonies that seemed both near and impossibly distant. Some swore the choir stood just beyond the cemetery wall. Others claimed the sound echoed from the very heart of the chapel, though its doors remained locked. One young girl, carried home from a night's vigil by her father, declared that the music was not in the air at all, but inside her head, as though someone were singing directly into her skull. What Setúbal experienced in those nights was not a single event, but the birth of a rhythm, as steady as the tides. Midnight became a time of anticipation. Some residents locked their shutters tight, refusing to acknowledge the sound. Others, emboldened by morbid curiosity, crept closer to the cemetery gates, daring one another to stay until the last note faded. And in the strange economy of rumor, the voices grew larger than themselves. A traveler passing through heard of the phantom choir before he even reached the town square. A candle merchant refused to pass the graveyard without making the sign of the cross. By the time weeks had passed, the phenomenon was no longer whispered by a few but known to all. And yet, strangely, no one claimed ownership of the voices. No choir admitted to secret practice, no group of pranksters stepped forward. The town's clergy insisted no such midnight services were performed. The music seemed to belong to no one, and therefore, to everyone. It was as if the dead themselves had decided to sing. The accounts we have today preserve not only the strangeness of the event but also its peculiar emotional weight. Those who heard the choir often remembered less the notes than the feeling, a heaviness in the chest, a pressure in the air, an awareness of being observed. The voices did not plead or threaten, but they made no attempt to comfort either. They were simply present, unwavering, like the tolling of bells or the breaking of waves. And it is from this beginning, from the midnight when the first widow froze before the cemetery gates, that our story unfolds. For in Setúbal, in the year 1883, the dead were said to sing each night for the living. And though countless ears bore witness, no living lips were ever seen to move. To understand why the midnight choir struck Setúbal with such power, one must first understand the Portugal of 1883. This was a nation steeped in sorrow, its people hardened by hardship yet vulnerable to every whisper of the unknown. In that decade, death was not an abstract idea but a daily companion. Cholera stalked the land with cruel persistence, and outbreaks swept through villages without warning, leaving behind rows of hastily dug graves. Malnutrition and famine added to the toll, for poor harvests and economic uncertainty made food scarce in many households. The cry of a mother mourning her child was as common as the call of gulls along the coast. Setúbal itself bore the scars of this struggle. Though it was a fishing port, reliant on the bounty of the sea, the industry was unpredictable. Storms claimed vessels without mercy, and widows in black shawls were a familiar sight along the quayside, staring into the horizon that had swallowed their husbands. Men went to sea not knowing if they would return, while on shore, their families lived in fragile cottages, their faith in survival balanced precariously on both providence and fortune. Amid such instability, religion was not a matter of choice but of necessity. The Catholic Church was the anchor of daily existence. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals bound the community together, and the parish priest held as much authority over hearts as the mayor did over law. Yet the church, too, was overwhelmed. Funerals were so frequent that priests conducted several burials in a single day. The ringing of bells that marked death was heard so often it became a rhythm of life. And for the people, every toll of those bells was not just a call to prayer but a reminder of their own fragile mortality. The cemetery of São Julião stood as the physical emblem of this sorrow. Its walls, damp with sea salt, enclosed a patchwork of stone crosses and weathered slabs, many marked only with initials or dates. Candles flickered constantly among the graves, for families lit them each night, praying that light might guide their loved ones through the dark beyond. The chapel beside it, though small, was perpetually filled with the smell of wax and incense, an aroma that mixed with the salt air into something uniquely Portuguese, something that spoke of faith, mourning, and resignation. To walk through Setúbal in those years was to move through a landscape where death had seeped into the very fabric of existence. Children played among gravestones because there was little ground elsewhere. Old women whispered prayers not just in church but at market stalls, crossing themselves at every rumor of sickness. And though the people bore their grief with resilience, there was an undercurrent of exhaustion, a weariness that made them susceptible to anything that promised meaning. It was into this atmosphere that the phantom choir entered. It is important to see that it did not arrive in a vacuum of joy, but in a society where music itself had already been claimed by sorrow. In every funeral procession, songs were sung, dirges of Latin and Portuguese verses pleading for the souls of the departed. In the church, the chant of priests was familiar, steady, comforting. So when the people of Setúbal heard the voices at midnight, they recognized the sound at once. It was the language of grief, of ritual, of the dead. This recognition is what made the mystery so haunting. Had the voices sounded like revelry, they might have been dismissed as drunks or pranksters. But they sounded like the liturgy of mourning, a sound that everyone in the town already knew too well. The line between the natural and the supernatural blurred because the choirs sang not in some alien tongue but in the very words that had been spoken over the coffins of their loved ones. Portugal in the 1880s was also a land of contradiction. On one hand, the Enlightenment had long since brought rational thought, and the educated elite in Lisbon debated science, progress, and industry. On the other hand, the countryside clung fiercely to folklore, to saints, to omens. Superstition and faith intermingled, producing a society where a candle lit in devotion might stand beside a charm hung to ward off evil spirits. For the people of Setúbal, to hear ghostly hymns was not simply a curiosity, it was a test of belief. Were these voices angels sent by God? Or souls trapped in torment? Or something darker still? The choir's timing made its impact all the greater. Midnight was already a liminal hour, a boundary between days, when church bells marked the passage of time and the town itself seemed to hold its breath. In Catholic thought, midnight had a dual meaning, a time of prayer and vigilance, but also a time when temptations and spirits were thought to stir. That the voices appeared precisely then, never earlier, never later, gave the phenomenon a ritual quality, as though it belonged to the order of the sacred rather than the chaos of chance. Setúbal's residents, already burdened by grief, found themselves unable to dismiss what they heard. For them, the phantom choir was not an isolated oddity but part of the larger tapestry of sorrow that enveloped their daily lives. Every note seemed to echo the losses they endured, every harmony resonated with the weight of their mourning. Thus, the stage was set. A town weary from suffering, a cemetery heavy with death, and a population steeped in both faith and fear. When the voices came, they did not arrive as intruders, but as reflections of a truth already lived, that in Setúbal, death was never far away, and the boundary between the living and the dead was fragile, permeable, and perhaps, in those strange months of 1883, broken altogether. The mystery of Setúbal's phantom choir began humbly, almost quietly, like a rumor not yet certain of its own power. And yet, from the first nights of sound, those who heard the voices knew they were in the presence of something deeply unnatural, something that seemed both familiar and impossibly alien. It started, according to testimony, with a widow named Maria Lopez. She was a woman of modest means, her husband taken by fever the year before, her eyes heavy with sorrow but her faith unshaken. On the night that changed her life, she carried a basket home from the harbor, her path taking her along the cemetery wall. It was late, and the streets of Setúbal lay quiet. The lanterns had burned low, the waves broke faintly against the shore, and a fog hung close to the ground. As she walked, Maria paused, sensing something unusual. Then, drifting through the mist, she heard it, voices, low and measured, rising in unison like the hum of monks in some hidden cloister. At first, she thought a midnight service might be underway inside the chapel. But when she peered through the iron bars, the grounds were deserted. The chapel's doors stood locked, its windows dark. Yet the voices continued, swelling in harmony, Latin words threading through the night air, Requiem aeternam dona eis. Grant them eternal rest. Maria stumbled back, her heart pounding. The voices were not loud, but they filled her ears with such clarity that she could not doubt them. She fled home, her rosary clutched tight, and whispered her experience only to a trusted neighbor. Yet within days, others claimed the same. 2 fishermen, returning from a late haul, reported hearing the same hymns. They swore the sound drifted across the tide, not from sea or land but from some point in between, as though the night itself were singing. They, too, insisted the voices stopped abruptly just as the church clock struck 12. The detail of timing would become one of the mystery's most unnerving consistencies. Every account, no matter the listener, no matter the vantage, agreed, the choir began at midnight, and always ended before the final bell. The ritual precision unnerved the townspeople more than the sound itself. A prankster could be unpredictable. A hallucination might fade in and out. But this was deliberate, exact, bound to the rhythm of the hours like a liturgy that refused interruption. Soon, word spread across Setúbal. The grocer's apprentice claimed he had heard it while closing shop. A young couple courting under the square's olive tree whispered that the music floated around them like a circle of unseen singers. A night watchman confessed that while he made his rounds, the hymns followed him from street to street, neither louder nor fainter, as if the voices adjusted their distance to remain always at his ear. The descriptions varied in small details but converged in tone. The choir was never raucous or chaotic. It was disciplined, ordered, its harmonies balanced like trained choristers rehearsing endlessly. Some called the sound beautiful, others haunting, but no one doubted its solemnity. This was not song for entertainment. It was song for ritual, for the dead. The more testimonies emerged, the more the phenomenon began to shape the psychology of the town. Midnight became a moment charged with dread. Children, once allowed to play freely, were hurried indoors before the bells began to toll. Families huddled in silence, straining their ears against shuttered windows. Curiosity warred with fear, and for every person who claimed to hear the choir, another swore they would never listen, lest something in the music call them toward the grave. Accounts from those nights reveal something more subtle, a physical sensation that accompanied the sound. One woman described her chest tightening, as though the air itself grew heavier when the voices began. Another said the hymns seemed to vibrate through the ground, making her teeth ache. Some reported dreams after hearing the choir, dreams of walking through endless rows of graves, always guided by unseen singers who faded just beyond reach. And yet, despite the strangeness, no one could prove the voices belonged to the living. Investigations were attempted, though they were more improvised than official. A group of men, skeptical and half-drunk, stationed themselves by the cemetery one night. They carried lanterns, prepared to confront whoever was responsible. But when the voices rose, their lantern flames sputtered and dimmed, as if pressed down by a sudden draft. The men swore the singing encircled them, coming from every side, yet no figure moved in the dark. By the time they rushed forward, the sound had vanished. They returned pale and shaken, their laughter gone. The earliest written account comes from a merchant passing through Setúbal. In his diary, now yellowed with age, he wrote, "Last night, I lingered near the square at the hour of midnight. From the cemetery came a harmony so exquisite and mournful I thought at first it must be a service for the dead. But no door was open, no candle burned. The music seemed to float upon the fog, neither near nor far, and when it ceased, the silence was dreadful beyond words." Such testimonies lent the phenomenon weight beyond rumor. Visitors, untainted by local gossip, corroborated what residents already feared: this was no illusion of grief, no trick of familiarity. Something unexplainable was taking place each night. The effect upon the town was profound. For a people already bound to mourning, the choir seemed like the embodiment of their sorrow-given voice. It was at once intimate and collective. Every listener swore the voices reached directly to them, and yet the sound belonged to all. Some claimed comfort in it, believing the dead sang to reassure the living. Others, trembling, whispered that the songs were not meant as comfort but as summons. In those first nights of sound, Setúbal shifted. It became a town of listeners, a place where midnight no longer passed in silence. Instead, it became an hour of reckoning, when the air itself seemed to vibrate with the border between life and death. And though no living choir stood visible, though no lips moved in shadow, the voices remained, constant, deliberate, and as precise as the tolling of the bells. It was the beginning of a mystery that would soon entangle the entire town, a mystery that defied denial, resisted explanation, and deepened with every passing night. By the end of summer, the mystery of Setúbal's phantom choir was no longer confined to widows and fishermen. It had entered the very bloodstream of the town, carried in whispers from door to door, from market stalls to the parish pews. No matter how firmly the church sought to suppress the story, the voices of the unseen choir proved more persuasive than any sermon. At first, the clergy tried to ignore the rumors. Father Joaquim, the parish priest of São Julião, warned his congregation against indulgence in superstition. From the pulpit, he thundered that the devil was cunning, that he cloaked himself in false wonders to lead souls astray. To those who mentioned hearing voices at midnight, he offered only stern rebuke. Faith, he insisted, belonged in the sacraments, not in shadows. Yet silence was impossible. The more the church denied, the more the whispers multiplied. Housewives repeated accounts while kneading bread, fishermen swapped tales as they mended their nets, and children dared one another to sneak near the cemetery wall. Some laughed nervously, dismissing the phenomenon as trickery or illusion, but even they lowered their voices, as though mocking might itself attract the choir's attention. The parish, normally a place of unity, began to divide. Some believed the voices were holy, angelic even, sent as a comfort to the grieving town. Others feared they were demonic, a deception meant to lure the faithful into error. Between these two camps stretched a wide gulf of unease, a silent tension that transformed the act of worship itself. The Mass continued, but the faithful found themselves distracted, glancing toward the chapel doors at the stroke of midnight, as though expecting the hymns to seep inside. The Church's firm denials only sharpened curiosity. "If there is nothing to fear," one fisherman muttered, "why do they forbid us to speak of it?" His words echoed a sentiment shared by many. People who had once trusted the clergy without question now wondered if silence was itself a confession. Perhaps the priests knew more than they admitted. Perhaps they, too, had heard the voices. Soon, stories began to spread of confrontations at the confessional. A young woman admitted she had lingered near the cemetery and heard the choir sing prayers of the dead. Instead of offering comfort, the priest scolded her harshly, warning that to return would endanger her soul. Word of this exchange spread quickly, turning what should have been a private act of confession into fuel for public doubt. If the voices were mere imagination, why was the church so afraid of them? In the town square, whispers turned darker still. Some claimed the priests themselves might be the source of the singing, gathering in secret at midnight to chant forbidden hymns. Others speculated that the choir was composed of the restless dead, priests from centuries past whose sins had condemned them to eternal service. Rumor, once unleashed, proved unstoppable, weaving fact and fear into a tapestry of suspicion. The effect upon daily life was unmistakable. Families forbade children from walking near the cemetery, not for fear of thieves or vagrants, but for fear that the unseen voices might somehow beckon them. Young lovers, reckless with curiosity, dared each other to test their courage by listening at the gates. And when they returned pale-faced, whispering of chants that rose and fell like waves, their stories only deepened the sense of unease. Even within the clergy, cracks appeared. While Father Joaquim thundered against superstition, younger priests whispered among themselves that something beyond natural explanation was indeed occurring. Some admitted quietly that they, too, had heard the hymns while walking home at night. Yet they dared not speak publicly, for fear of scandal, punishment, or accusations of weakness in faith. Thus the church became a house divided, its outward silence concealing an inward crisis. The people of Setúbal, meanwhile, lived caught between two authorities, the authority of the church, which denied the voices, and the authority of their own senses, which could not. Which was to be trusted? To believe the church was to doubt one's own ears. To believe one's ears was to risk sin. And so, caught between obedience and experience, the town learned to whisper. These whispers were not without consequence. In a society where faith had long been the anchor of order, to question the church's authority was dangerous. Yet the phantom choir left no choice. Night after night, the voices returned, undeniable, unshaken by denial. Families who had never questioned their priest now found themselves huddling at home, praying not with the church but against it, seeking protection from something the clergy refused to acknowledge. For the people, the silence of the church was more frightening than the voices themselves. It created a void in which fear multiplied unchecked. If the priests would not explain, then the imagination would. And in that imagination, the phantom choir grew darker, larger, more powerful with every retelling. By autumn, Setúbal was a town transformed. Its prayers were sharper, its silences heavier. The parish, once the heart of communal unity, now throbbed with quiet division. Some attended Mass with defiance, others with fear, but all with the awareness that the mysteries of heaven and hell were no longer confined to distant sermons. They had come home, sung each midnight beyond the cemetery gates, and no denial could drive them away. The whispers of the parish did not still the voices. They only deepened them. And in the tension between faith and fear, the mystery of the midnight choir grew into something larger than itself, something that would not be contained by silence, not by scolding, and not by prayer. By the close of 1883, the phantom choir of Setúbal was no longer a tale passed in hushed tones at the market. It had become something undeniable, a phenomenon whispered of not only in the town itself but also in nearby villages and ports. Yet even as the voices multiplied in reputation, the official word from both civic leaders and the church was the same: there was nothing to speak of, nothing to hear, nothing to believe. The denial began subtly. Town officials, already strained by economic hardship and fearful of ridicule, discouraged discussion. They dismissed the stories as exaggerations born of grief or imagination. But when travelers began writing their own testimonies, the stance hardened. Priests doubled down, warning that repeating such tales was sinful, that to give the voices attention was to risk falling into Satan's snare. Authorities, likewise, refused to acknowledge the reports in public meetings. Silence became the policy. Yet silence cannot erase what is heard. As autumn wind swept colder across Setúbal, the voices continued at midnight, precise and unyielding. For the people, the repetition itself became proof. Tricksters could not sustain such order. Hallucinations did not strike entire neighborhoods at once. Whatever the source, it was persistent, disciplined, and utterly indifferent to official denial. Travelers passing through Setúbal gave the mystery new strength. A merchant from Lisbon, lodging overnight near the harbor, recorded in his journal, "I was woken by a harmony so mournful, so exquisite, I believed myself dreaming. Yet my servant, too, heard it, and we both stood at the window transfixed. When it ended, I could not persuade myself that silence was natural. It was as though the night itself had been hollowed out by absence." When accounts such as this began to circulate in Lisbon, the town could no longer be dismissed as a nest of superstition. Outsiders had heard it, too. For the residents of Setúbal, the official refusal to acknowledge what they experienced created a dangerous tension. On one side stood their senses, their very ears, which told them the choir existed. On the other side stood authority, demanding obedience to silence. Many chose their senses. Quietly, they passed their testimonies among neighbors, their certainty hardening into defiance. The more the church forbade discussion, the more the people believed something profound was being hidden. Some claimed this suppression was itself a kind of confession. "Why do they deny so strongly?" one widow whispered, "if nothing is there?" The denial seemed too forceful, too urgent. Rumors flourished that the priests themselves were terrified, that they had heard the voices but could not admit it for fear of scandal. Others suggested the authorities feared outsiders would think the town cursed, which might drive trade away. In either case, silence was not interpreted as authority but as weakness. Yet the choir itself remained unchanged. It never shouted, never grew louder, never altered its ritual. Each night at midnight it sang, and each night it fell silent at the bell. To the faithful, this constancy was more credible than the words of any priest. The unseen choir did not waver, men did. And so, ironically, the denial of the church strengthened the conviction of the people. One striking example comes from a diary kept by a sailor's wife, Katerina. She wrote, "The priest said today there are no voices. But last night, I heard them with my son beside me. He clutched my arm and asked if angels were speaking. How can I tell him it was nothing? It was not nothing. I feel it still." Such personal testimonies multiplied, scribbled in letters, diaries, and marginal notes. To the outside world, they were fragments. To the town, they were proof. Fear, however, was never far away. For every villager who took comfort in the thought of angels singing, another muttered of demons cloaking themselves in beauty. The uncertainty gnawed at the community. What if the priests were right? What if the denial was protection, not deception? Unable to resolve the contradiction, the people of Setúbal lived in a state of suspension, caught between faith in their own experience and doubt instilled by the very institution that guided their lives. What cannot be spoken aloud often becomes more powerful. Denial did not weaken the story of the Midnight Choir. It transformed it into forbidden knowledge, shared only in whispers, which made it irresistible. Children overheard their parents' warnings and longed all the more to hear the hymns for themselves. Sailors carried the tale to other ports, where it grew in wonder with every telling. A secret, after all, is often more compelling than a declaration. By November, the town existed in two realities at once. In the daylight, officials spoke of trade, harvests, and politics. Priests conducted mass as if nothing were amiss. Yet as the sun set and the hour of midnight approached, the other reality took hold, shutters were drawn, lamps extinguished, hearts braced for the sound that denial could not smother. In this strange tension, Setúbal endured. Its people were not united, but they were unshaken. The phantom choir had entered their lives, and no decree could drive it out. Whether angel or demon, comfort or curse, the voices belonged to the night now. And the more the church denied them, the more certain the people became that the truth of what they heard lay beyond the reach of any earthly authority. By the turn of winter in late 1883, the strange harmony of Setúbal had shifted from wonder into burden. At first, the voices had seemed like a marvel, a curiosity whispered with awe. But as the weeks dragged on, and the nightly hymns showed no sign of ceasing, the effect upon the town began to change. What once fascinated now eroded peace. The choir did not merely visit at midnight, it came to dominate the rhythm of every household's life. Sleep, once taken for granted, became an elusive treasure. Families learned to anticipate the stroke of 12, lying awake in anxious silence until the first note drifted across the cobblestones. Some prayed the sound would not come, that perhaps at last the mystery had ended. But the moment the bells announced the hour, the harmonies followed, unwavering, like an answer that could not be avoided. Parents tried to hush their children, yet the younger ones stirred and whispered questions that could not be answered. Was it holy? Was it dangerous? Why did no one admit to singing? The longer the voices persisted, the more the town suffered. Men rose each morning pale and restless, their work dulled by exhaustion. Fishermen who depended on the sea's early tides found themselves slow, distracted, even reckless. Tools slipped from weary hands. Markets opened later. Tempers flared more quickly. It was as if Setúbal itself had been deprived of slumber, its very stones sagging with weariness. Those who lived closest to the cemetery fared the worst. They swore that the music seemed not distant but near, as though the singers stood behind the very walls of their homes. Some described hearing individual notes brushing against their ears, like voices pressed too close in a darkened room. Others claimed that, though the choir always sang in harmony, one voice seemed to single them out, weaving through the chords with an intimacy that made the blood run cold. No matter where one turned in the house, it followed, patient and steady, until the final echo died. The mind, deprived of rest, plays cruel tricks. Some townspeople began to see shapes in the shadows, processions that vanished when lamps were lit, or faces flickering in windows long since abandoned. A widow swore she saw her late husband standing in the mist one night, mouthing words in time with the phantom hymn. Another woman, fevered with sleeplessness, claimed she heard her name woven into the chant itself, syllables stretched and broken into sacred tones. Not everyone suffered equally. There were those who began to cherish the music. A few townsfolk admitted, in careful whispers, that they found comfort in the hymns, as though lulled into a strange serenity rather than kept awake. Some even said they no longer required ordinary sleep, that the choir itself restored them in some mysterious way. These individuals, far from exhausted, seemed almost transformed, serene, detached, eyes gleaming with a calm that unnerved their neighbors. Were they blessed, or were they touched by something darker? The town could not decide. Doctors from Lisbon eventually traveled south to investigate, though not under official sanction. They heard no voices on the nights they stayed, whether by coincidence or by some unseen choice of the phenomenon, no one knew. But they were able to examine the townspeople themselves. What they found troubled them: widespread insomnia, anxious temperaments, trembling hands, and in some, symptoms akin to hysteria. They concluded the choir was nothing more than a mass delusion born of suggestion and fatigue. Yet this answer satisfied no one. The doctors could not explain how strangers, travelers, sailors, merchants, had also reported the sound, unaffected by the supposed contagion of local imagination. With each passing week, the choir's stranglehold deepened. Midnight became the town's true clock, more powerful than sunrise or bells. Daily schedules bent around it. Children napped during daylight, since night offered none. Merchants adjusted their trade, opening later in the day. Fishermen risked tides rather than risk collapse from exhaustion. Weddings were delayed, funerals subdued, arguments sparked over nothing more than whose turn it was to keep watch when infants cried at the hour of the hymn. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the reports of people who wandered into the night, drawn by the music as though sleepwalking. Neighbors described seeing figures drift toward the cemetery at midnight, barefoot and blank-eyed, moving in silence until the hymn ended. Once the final note faded, they seemed to awaken, confused, ashamed, and terrified to discover how far they had gone. One elderly man was found standing at the churchyard gate, hands pressed together in prayer, though he swore he had gone to bed hours earlier. The fear of being compelled by the choir entered every conversation. Families began to bar their doors at night, not to keep thieves out but to keep themselves in. Some even tied ropes across thresholds, convinced it would stop them should the voices call them into the street. The image of a town restraining itself in its own home spoke of a deeper terror, that the midnight hymn had moved beyond sound into possession. And still, the denial of authority continued. Priests thundered from pulpits that nothing unnatural disturbed Setúbal, that Satan thrived upon rumor. But the very insistence rang hollow. By now, the people no longer required the validation of authority. They lived with the choir each night. They bore its weight in their bodies, in their weary minds. They knew it more intimately than they knew their own leaders. By December, Setúbal was a place suspended between waking and dreaming, neither wholly alive by day nor truly at rest by night. The town had become an unwilling instrument, forced to endure the ceaseless refrain of something unseen, something unmoved by denial or fear. What began as a marvel had grown into an ordeal, a torment that gnawed not only at the flesh but at the very certainty of reality. The choir had not changed its voice. It had not grown louder, nor softer, nor crueler. It remained steady, eternal, patient. But the people had changed. Sleep was no longer safe. Dreams were no longer private. Midnight was no longer merely the passage of time, it was a visitation. And each night, as the bells marked the hour, Setúbal held its breath, knowing the voices would return, faithful as ever, to torment and to remind them that some mysteries do not fade, but only deepen. By the beginning of 1884, the people of Setúbal had grown desperate for an explanation. To live with mystery is to live with unease, and while fear can be endured for a time, the human mind yearns for reason. Something must be responsible, they told themselves. Something must account for the hymns that rang at midnight, precise as the toll of a clock, unrelenting as the tide. And so began the search for rational answers. The first theories came from the clergy, though cloaked in caution. Some priests admitted, in whispers, that perhaps there were monks from another town conducting vigils in secret, traveling unseen by day and returning to their cloisters before dawn. But the idea quickly crumbled. No neighboring monastery claimed involvement, and the hymns were unlike any known liturgy. The words were faint, sometimes indecipherable, the melodies shifting between familiar psalms and strains unknown. How could strangers know every verse yet sing in harmonies that no choir had rehearsed? Others suggested musicians, perhaps a group of students or vagrants who delighted in tormenting the town. Patrols were formed, men carrying lanterns and sticks, determined to catch the culprits in the act. But every search ended the same way. The voices grew stronger the nearer they approached the cemetery, yet no figure could be found among the graves. The patrols would circle, shadows leaping in lamplight, their own breathing harsh in the cold air, until the hymn reached its end and silence fell. When they returned home, they returned defeated. The townspeople then turned to the sea. Setúbal was a port, a place of trade and travel. Could it be that sailors anchored offshore sang hymns for their dead, the sound carrying inland upon the night breeze? At first the explanation seemed possible, until skeptics noted the flawless punctuality. The tide did not dictate these voices, they arrived at the very stroke of 12, with the discipline of a clockmaker. Furthermore, no vessel anchored consistently in the harbor for so many nights. Captains questioned in daylight denied all knowledge. It was the physicians who attempted the boldest explanation. They declared the town had fallen victim to hysteria, a collective delusion born of fatigue and expectation. The voices were not real, they insisted, but a trick of the mind amplified by gossip. To prove their claim, they instructed townsfolk to stuff their ears with cotton at midnight, certain that silence would cure the illusion. Yet even those who could hear nothing still felt the voices within them, vibrating in their chests, echoing behind the eyes like a pressure that would not relent. To be deaf to the sound was not to escape it, it was only to suffer its ghost in silence. Another theory arose from the natural philosophers. Perhaps, they proposed, it was an atmospheric phenomenon, the product of wind passing through the stone corridors of the town or across the hollows of the cemetery walls. Sound, after all, can play tricks, echoes and harmonics can weave voices where none exist. But this too faltered under scrutiny. The melodies were structured, deliberate, and often included words recognizable to those listening. Wind may wail, but it does not chant. Stone may hum, but it does not harmonize. As winter wore on, the theories grew stranger. Some whispered of smugglers using coded songs to guide one another in the dark. Others believed foreign spies attempted to unnerve the town, weakening its resolve. But such speculations lacked evidence. No contraband was discovered, no conspirators arrested. The music was pure, untouchable, free of earthly trails. Then came the most unsettling reports of all, testimonies that suggested the voices might not be external at all. A scholar visiting from Coimbra interviewed dozens of townsfolk and noted a disturbing pattern. Many insisted they did not merely hear the choir, but felt compelled to join it. Several confessed they found themselves mouthing the words, their lips shaping verses against their will. One man admitted he awoke to discover himself singing aloud, though no sound had passed his ears. Another woman, pale and trembling, declared she had not only sung with the choir but had recognized one of the voices as belonging to her deceased mother. These confessions spread unease like wildfire. If the voices were within, then there could be no escape. Closing windows, locking doors, even fleeing the town would not free them, for the choir lived not in air but in flesh and memory. Still, the rationalists pressed on. They conducted experiments, gathering groups in separate parts of town to record what they heard. At dawn, the testimonies were compared. The results disturbed even the skeptics. Though not identical in every detail, the accounts shared remarkable consistencies, the same hymn noted by multiple witnesses, the same verses heard in the same order, even the same pauses and breaths. Could mass hysteria achieve such precision? Or did this suggest that something real, external, and structured persisted beyond mere imagination? The town council convened in secrecy to discuss what to do. Suggestions ranged from hiring detectives to calling in the army. Yet what soldier could be sent against a choir that left no trace? What investigator could arrest an echo? And what would it mean for the dignity of Setúbal if word spread that its people feared songs sung by no one? Pride prevented decisive action, and so the council resolved, in its silence, to do nothing. But silence breeds suspicion. Many townsfolk began to believe the council knew more than they admitted, that perhaps the leaders were concealing the truth. Rumors circulated that one councilman had seen figures in the graveyard and sworn his oath to secrecy. Others claimed priests had begged him to keep silent, for the church would not permit such a scandal. Conspiracy grew in the vacuum of certainty, and with it, trust in authority eroded. At the heart of the search for answers was a deeper struggle, one that cut to the soul of every listener. Was the choir sacred or profane? Was it proof of God's nearness, or of the devil's deceit? Could voices that sang hymns be wicked? Could they be holy if they led to despair? Some clung to belief, assuring themselves that angels walked unseen among the graves. Others muttered of restless spirits, tormented souls denied peace. And still others, drained of faith and of reason, accepted only that the world was no longer what they thought it to be. The pursuit of rational answers had led the town in circles, through science, through superstition, through doubt and denial, only to return to mystery once again. The voices remained, unchanged, patient, unmoved by theory or investigation. Each night they sang, and each night the people of Setúbal listened, weary yet unable to turn away. The mind craved explanation, but the heart knew there was none. The midnight choir belonged to no logic and no man. It belonged to the hour itself, eternal and indifferent, reminding all who heard that some questions are not meant to be answered. By the spring of 1884, Setúbal was no longer the bustling coastal town it had once been. What had begun as curiosity, then fear, had hardened into something heavier, isolation. The midnight choir had become a constant presence, like a sickness one learns to live with, but never escapes. People withdrew into themselves, each night waiting with dread for the toll of 12. Doors were bolted, shutters drawn, candles extinguished early, as if darkness itself might somehow dull the sound. But no barrier could keep it out. The hymns passed through wood and stone, through glass and iron. They lived not only in the air but in the marrow of the listeners. The first sign of the town's descent was the market square. Once alive with chatter, bargaining, and the laughter of children, it grew quiet. Merchants complained of dwindling trade. Fishermen who had sailed joyfully out at dawn now left in sullen silence, their nets hauled without song. Conversations turned short, guarded, even among neighbors. To admit that one heard the voices in a particular way, or that one felt drawn to them, risked suspicion. Trust thinned. Community frayed. The sound had not merely unsettled their nights, it had poisoned their days. Families fractured. There were those who insisted the choir was divine, a blessing to be cherished, and those who cursed it as a curse upon the town. Husbands quarreled with wives, brothers with sisters. More than one household was said to have split in two, one half fleeing to stay with distant relatives inland, the other remaining behind, unable to abandon the graves of their kin. What loyalty bound a family when one side saw angels, and the other saw demons? Priests tried to maintain order, urging the congregation to resist division, to keep their faith whole. But even within the church, rifts spread. One priest, pale with exhaustion, began to declare the voices were the souls of purgatory, pleading for prayer. Another argued they were a temptation sent to test obedience. Parishioners shifted pews, sat apart, whispered about which side was right. The church itself became infected by the same doubt that haunted the streets. Those most sensitive to the music began to withdraw entirely. A widow named Katerina stopped leaving her home. Her neighbors reported she spent her days staring at the cemetery from her window, lips moving silently as if rehearsing songs yet to come. Children, too, began to act strangely. Some awoke at midnight, eyes wide, insisting they had been walking in their dreams toward the graves. Others grew mute, refusing to speak by daylight, as though saving their voices for the unseen choir. Parents wept in secret, unable to understand what was happening to their sons and daughters. Madness crept quietly, but steadily. A blacksmith, once known for his booming laughter, grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. He claimed the choir followed him even into the forge, rising above the ring of hammer on iron. One morning he was found collapsed in the street, mouth open in a silent hymn, his hands bloodied by burns he could not explain. A seamstress, gentle and devout, began to hum the tunes while she worked, her needle keeping time to melodies only she could hear. She vanished one night, her door left open, her bed unslept in. They searched the cemetery, of course, but found no sign of her. The cemetery itself became a place no one dared to tread after dark. By day, the air there seemed charged, as if holding its breath until night returned. The weeds grew faster among the graves, as though nourished by the songs. Some gravestones cracked, their faces worn more quickly than time should allow. A few townsfolk claimed to see shapes moving among the tombs even before the hymns began, vague figures that faded when approached. But no one wished to linger long enough to know for certain. Visitors ceased to come. Word of the midnight choir had spread beyond Setúbal, drawing whispers from Lisbon to Porto, but rather than attracting pilgrims, it repelled them. Traders passed through quickly, preferring to sleep outside town rather than risk a night within. Letters arrived less often. Those who could afford to leave did so, abandoning their homes to relatives or tenants. Those who remained grew fewer and more weary, trapped by poverty or loyalty, bound to the town as if by invisible chains. The isolation did not end with the physical. It burrowed into the soul. People stopped speaking openly of the voices, as though naming them gave them power. Families ate in silence, heads bowed, utensils scraping plates in lifeless rhythm. Neighbors passed one another without greeting. Even laughter, when it came, seemed brittle, forced, a hollow performance that faded too quickly. The town lived as though under siege, not by soldiers, but by sound. The council, fearful of panic, issued decrees forbidding discussion of the phenomenon in public. To speak of the choir was deemed harmful to the order of Setúbal. But censorship could not bind thought. It only deepened the sense of suffocation. People grew suspicious of one another, fearful that a careless remark might be reported. Friends became strangers, strangers became spies. The choir had not only taken their nights, it had stolen their trust. In this silence, loneliness grew unbearable. Some turned to their diaries, pouring out their fears onto paper that might never be read. Others sought solace in prayer, kneeling in the darkness of their rooms, begging for release. A few, exhausted by waiting, went willingly to the cemetery at midnight, determined to confront the singers. None returned the same. One young man staggered home at dawn with his hair turned white. Another was found kneeling among the graves, eyes vacant, lips whispering hymns long after the choir had ceased. The descent into isolation was not swift, nor dramatic. It was slow erosion, steady and unstoppable, like cliffs eaten by the sea. Each night another stone was worn away, each morning the town woke a little smaller, a little quieter, a little less itself. And though the people could still see one another, faces pale in candlelight, eyes heavy with dread, they no longer recognized the community they once shared. They were alone together, prisoners of a sound that had no source, captives of a choir that had made silence its cruelest weapon. By midsummer, Setúbal was a town emptied of joy. No festivals were held, no weddings celebrated, no music played in taverns. The only song that remained belonged to the dead, or to something that wore the dead's voice as its mask. And the people, weary and divided, waited for the next stroke of midnight, knowing they could neither endure it nor escape it. By the autumn of 1884, Setúbal was no longer a town living under a mystery, it had become a town consumed by it. What had once been a shared dread now hardened into a breaking point. The midnight choir, relentless and unchanged, pushed the people beyond endurance. Where before there had been whispers and cautious silence, now there was only collapse. The first signs of the breaking were physical. People began abandoning their homes not in secret but openly, their carts loaded with belongings, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Whole streets emptied overnight. Neighbors woke to find houses deserted, shutters banging in the wind, doors hanging open like mouths frozen mid-cry. Those who stayed watched the exodus with envy or bitterness, trapped by poverty, obligation, or the weight of land they could not leave behind. But escape was not always salvation. Families who fled inland often returned days later, pale and shaken, confessing that the voices had followed them. They swore that in the dead of night, far from Setúbal, they had still heard faint strains of hymns drifting through the hills. Some claimed the sound lived within their dreams, refusing to be left behind. These returnees became outcasts, their presence unwelcome reminders that distance did not mean deliverance. The cemetery grew stranger with each passing night. Villagers reported seeing more movement among the graves, shadows rising before midnight, shifting as though rehearsing their roles in the coming performance. The grass thickened unnaturally, curling over tombstones, as if pulled upward by unseen hands. Some graves seemed to sink, their soil disturbed without spade or rain. When dawn came, these signs remained, silent evidence of something that refused to rest. The turning point came with the disappearance of Father Anselmo. He had been one of the few still urging calm, insisting the choir was merely a trial of faith. One night he resolved to confront the mystery directly. Witnesses claimed they saw him walk toward the cemetery at dusk, a lantern in one hand and a crucifix in the other. The hymns began as usual at midnight, but when they ended, the priest did not return. His lantern was later found extinguished by the cemetery wall, its glass unbroken, its handle still warm as though only recently held. His absence broke whatever fragile hope the townspeople still clung to. In the days that followed, chaos spread. Some townsfolk spoke of rebellion against the silence imposed by the council, demanding open discussion of what plagued them. Others accused the church of hiding the truth, of colluding with powers they dared not name. Fights erupted in the taverns, once places of uneasy quiet, now filled with shouts and blows. A woman accused her neighbor of bringing the choir by practicing forbidden rites. He, in turn, accused her of being one of the singers. Distrust blossomed into hysteria. And then, there were the vanishings. Not just of Father Anselmo, but of ordinary townsfolk. A baker failed to open his shop one morning. His family insisted he had gone to bed as usual, but his bed was empty at dawn, the sheets cold. A young girl disappeared from her locked room, the window unlatched though no one had climbed it. The blacksmith who had once collapsed in the street vanished entirely, his forge left half-finished, the metal cooling on his anvil. These vanishings left behind no struggle, no blood, no footprints, only absence. Whispers spread that those taken had joined the choir. Some swore that certain voices in the hymn sounded familiar, carrying tones they recognized from the missing. Mothers wept when they believed they heard their children's voices woven into the midnight chorus. Wives covered their ears when they thought they recognized their husbands. Whether true or delusion, the belief deepened the town's unraveling. To hear the choir was to fear the loss of oneself. The council dissolved into impotence. Its decrees no longer carried weight, its members divided and fearful. One councilman vanished, another fled. The remaining few ceased meeting altogether. Authority evaporated, leaving only chaos. Without leadership, the town fractured entirely. Families barricaded themselves indoors. Some dug makeshift trenches around their homes, as though preparing for siege. Others surrendered to despair, wandering the streets at night, daring the choir to claim them. The climax came on a night when the hymns changed. Until then, the choir had always sung the same handful of melodies, haunting but predictable. But on this night, the voices swelled louder, more complex, weaving harmonies no one had heard before. The sound rose not only from the cemetery but from every corner of the town, reverberating from the walls, the wells, even the sea. Windows shattered. Animals bolted from their pens, neighing, howling, scattering into the dark. Children screamed that they saw figures standing at the ends of their beds, mouths open in silent song. The entire town seemed engulfed in music that did not belong to the living. When dawn finally came, silence reigned. Too much silence. Entire streets were empty. Houses stood with doors ajar, meals unfinished on tables, beds half slept in. No footprints led away. It was as if whole families had dissolved into the air, leaving only their belongings behind. The few survivors who remained wandered through Setúbal in shock, counting the missing, finding more emptiness than presence. The vanishings were not total. A handful of families endured, perhaps by chance, perhaps because they never opened their doors that night. But they lived in a town gutted of its life, a hollow echo of what it had once been. Where laughter had once rung, only wind moved. Where prayers had once been spoken, only silence lingered. And still, at midnight, the choir sang. The vanishings were never explained. Some believed those taken had been claimed by restless souls. Others whispered of punishment for hidden sins, or that the earth itself had swallowed them into the graves they had tried so long to avoid. A few muttered of plague, of madness, of mass flight disguised as disappearance. But none of these explanations satisfied the reality of Setúbal's hollowed streets. The collapse was not marked by a single event, but by the slow and dreadful realization that the town itself was being erased. Piece by piece, voice by voice, until what remained was only absence. A vanishing point, not only of lives but of meaning. And in that void, the midnight hymns continued, tireless, unbroken, as though the choir would go on until every living soul was gone, and only the dead remained to sing. When the collapse had run its course, what remained of Setúbal was no longer a living town but a shell. The once bustling streets, marked by the hammer of the blacksmith and the chatter of markets, had fallen into near silence. A handful of families lingered in their homes, refusing to leave for reasons they themselves could barely explain. They swept their doorsteps each morning, tended to their gardens, fed their animals, but each act of routine felt brittle and hollow. There was no longer any sense of community, only scattered fragments of life clinging to habits. The silence weighed more heavily than the hymns themselves. By day, one could almost pretend life was normal. The river still glistened, fishermen still pulled in their nets, the bells of goats still clattered in the distance. But the absence of neighbors, the empty shutters, the streets where children no longer played, hung over everything like a shroud. It was not merely a matter of population loss, it was the profound knowledge that those who had vanished had done so without reason, without trace, without farewell. At night, the silence became unbearable. Even before the midnight hymns began, the town felt like a stage set for tragedy. Survivors described listening for the sound of footsteps, of laughter, of some reminder that others still lived nearby, but hearing nothing but the occasional creak of beams and the rustle of wind. They dreaded the moment when the silence would rupture, when the first notes of the choir would rise. And without fail, at the stroke of 12, the voices returned, carrying the weight of those who had once walked among them. Many survivors claimed that the voices sounded closer now. They no longer seemed confined to the cemetery. Instead, they seemed to emanate from empty homes, echoing through deserted windows. Some even swore the hymns came from within their own walls, as though the vanished had not left at all but had simply stepped sideways into another state of being, inhabiting the spaces they had once lived in. To lie awake at night was to wonder whether the voice carrying the tenor line was the baker, whether the soprano was the child who had disappeared from her locked room. The emotional aftermath was unlike any ordinary grief. There were no funerals to attend, no graves to mark, no certainty of death. The missing were neither alive nor dead in the minds of those left behind. They were suspended in an impossible in-between, their absence confirmed but their fate unspoken. Widows did not remarry, for how could they, when they could not swear their husbands were gone? Parents did not move on, for how could they, when they sometimes thought they still heard their children singing in the night? The church, once a pillar of the town, struggled under the burden of unanswered questions. With Father Anselmo vanished, there was no leader to guide them. A younger priest from a nearby parish arrived eventually, but his sermons rang hollow. He urged the people to see the events as trials, tests of their endurance. But his words fell into the silence like stones into a bottomless well. Faith itself began to fracture. Some abandoned the church entirely, refusing to pray to a God who permitted such horrors. Others clung more tightly than ever, retreating into desperate rituals, whispering psalms as though they might ward off the midnight songs. What was most chilling was the way the outside world responded. News of the vanishings and the choir had seeped into surrounding towns, but most treated it as rumor, superstition, or local madness. A few curious outsiders ventured in, drawn by fascination with the macabre. They spent a night in Setúbal, heard the choir for themselves, and left shaken, never to return. Most, however, avoided the town altogether, believing it cursed. Trade routes shifted. Merchants chose longer paths to skirt the place. Maps began marking Setúbal with subtle warnings, a town not to linger in. The survivors were abandoned not only by their neighbors but by the world. Generations later, descendants of those who endured would still recall this abandonment. Old men would tell of how their fathers had begged nearby towns for aid, for food, for priests to perform blessings, but how the requests were always denied. It was said that one nearby village went so far as to build a wall at the edge of its road, sealing itself from contact. The silence around Setúbal extended beyond its own borders. It was a silence imposed by others, fearful of contamination, fearful of being drawn into the music. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors became distrustful of one another, suspicious of any unusual sound or behavior. If someone sang too softly while working, others grew uneasy. If someone spoke too much of the missing, others accused them of being obsessed, of inviting danger. There was no comfort in sharing memories, only risk. And so memories were buried in silence, unspoken, locked away in the dark corners of the mind where they festered. Children born in the aftermath grew up under this pall. They were taught not to ask about the vanished, not to acknowledge the hymns. When they heard the choir, they were told to pray silently and never repeat what they thought they recognized. Silence became survival, passed from parent to child as carefully as bread or water. Entire generations learned to live with dread as their constant companion, taught that questions were more dangerous than answers. But silence does not erase. It only buries. And as years turned to decades, the weight of what had happened in Setúbal pressed heavier on the survivors and their descendants. The cemetery remained untouched, its graves never exhumed, its gates rusting into stillness. The town never fully recovered its population. Travelers continued to avoid it. Even as Portugal modernized, trains bypassed the town, telegraph wires skipped its borders, and later roads were diverted away. Setúbal became a hushed name, spoken in stories and half-remembered warnings, a place of erasure rather than growth. Still, the midnight hymns never ceased. Survivors grew old and died, and their children replaced them in hearing the same voices at the same hour. Some said the hymns grew fainter, others swore they grew louder. None could prove it, for no outsider lingered long enough to study them. It was as though Setúbal had been locked into a loop, condemned to carry the memory of its loss every night until the end of time. The aftermath of Setúbal was not a dramatic conclusion, not an exorcism or a cleansing. It was slow suffocation. A silencing of joy, of memory, of identity. What remained was endurance, not triumph, not healing, but simply survival. And in many ways, survival was its own cruelty, forcing those left behind to live in a liminal space between the past and the present, between the living and the dead. This was Setúbal's legacy, a place defined not by what was there, but by what had vanished. A town where silence was not peace but torment, and where the hymns that filled the midnight air were not simply songs, but reminders that what was lost could never be found, and what was endured could never be spoken. The story of Setúbal's midnight choir, and the disappearances that shadowed it, refused to settle into a single explanation. For centuries, those who encountered fragments of the tale, be they villagers, priests, historians, or skeptical travelers, sought to impose order on the chaos. Yet every theory was fragile, every hypothesis cracked beneath the weight of what could not be explained. The town became a mirror, reflecting the fears and desires of those who tried to interpret it. And in the end, Setúbal's silence left only questions, unresolved and enduring. The most immediate theory, whispered by the few clergymen who dared visit, was that of divine punishment. They saw the vanishing of families as an echo of biblical wrath, a warning to others of sin left unconfessed. In their sermons, they described Setúbal as a new Sodom, a place whose hidden transgressions had called down celestial justice. The midnight choir, they claimed, was the voice of angels, or of the damned, singing a dirge for the condemned. Yet this theory failed to comfort, for even the devout struggled to name what sin had been so grave that children should vanish from locked rooms, or that faithful priests should be swept away alongside the indifferent. Divine punishment explained everything and nothing. Another theory grew among villagers who lived on the fringes, those who still believed in old legends of the land. They spoke of the cemetery as cursed ground, a place where restless souls had gathered for centuries. They pointed to stories of unbaptized infants buried in secret, of soldiers slain in forgotten wars, of heretics burned and scattered. Perhaps, they suggested, the soil itself had grown hungry, the air thick with spirits who longed for bodies to reclaim. The midnight hymns, in this telling, were not holy but spectral, a gathering of the dead, their songs both lament and lure. Those who vanished had not been taken, they argued, but had joined the choir willingly, seduced by a music only they could truly hear. Historians, approaching the story from centuries later, found themselves trapped between skepticism and wonder. Some dismissed the entire saga as folklore, a tale born from plague or famine, its details exaggerated across generations until vanishings became supernatural, and silence became song. They argued that families likely fled, driven by poverty or disease, and that the choir was no more than wind through crypts, owls calling in the night, or distant travelers' songs distorted by air. Yet those who spent time in Setúbal contradicted them. Outsiders who had heard the midnight voices left shaken, insisting it was not mere imagination. Even the most rational historian could not erase first-hand testimony. Men of science, scholars of faith, ordinary traders, all swore they had heard human voices in harmony where no singers stood. The psychological explanation carried weight for some. Perhaps, they argued, the survivors' minds had fractured under the strain of inexplicable disappearances. In the void of answers, they created meaning from nothing. The midnight choir was hallucination, born of trauma. The vanishings were abductions, accidents, or deliberate desertions reimagined as mystery to shield the community from shame. In this view, Setúbal was not cursed but wounded, its people so broken that they conjured voices in the silence. Yet again, this theory faltered in the face of outsiders' accounts, for hallucinations rarely extend beyond those traumatized, and yet travelers, sailors, and even soldiers all testified to the same impossible music. There were whispers of darker theories too, of cults that had once thrived in secrecy, of rituals performed in the cemetery at midnight. Some believed that Father Anselmo himself, though outwardly pious, had been involved in such rites, and that his disappearance was not an accident but a consummation of forbidden vows. Others pointed to the precision of the choir's harmonies, too structured, too perfect, too unlike the raw chanting of ghosts. Perhaps, they said, Setúbal had been home to a sect that worshipped through song, and when their time came, they had departed this world together, leaving only echoes behind. But if so, why did their voices persist long after? Why did the hymns continue even when no cult remained to sing them? Still others searched for explanations in nature. They wondered whether strange acoustics, hidden caverns, or geological phenomena could account for the voices. Portugal's coast was riddled with caves, after all, and some scientists suggested that underground chambers might carry and amplify sounds from distant places. Could travelers miles away, singing hymns of their own, have been channeled into Setúbal's cemetery by the quirks of stone and sea? It was plausible, until one considered the familiarity of the voices. Survivors recognized them, swore they belonged to their own kin. No cavern could mimic the tenor of a brother, the lilt of a mother, the high cry of a child. The theories piled upon one another, overlapping and contradicting, yet never resolving. And perhaps that was the final cruelty of Setúbal, not only the vanishings, not only the unending choir, but the impossibility of truth. Each answer dissolved into air, each certainty collapsed into silence. What lingered most, for those who studied the tale, was not the search for explanation but the question of meaning. Why did the voices sing hymns, and not laments or laughter or cries? Why did they appear only at midnight, and why did they never fade with time? Why did the vanishing stop, yet the choir remain? These were the mysteries that haunted both scholar and villager alike. Some dared to see it as a blessing in disguise, that the vanished were not lost, but had been transfigured, lifted into a state beyond flesh. To hear them sing was to be reminded that death was not the end, that the spirit lived on in chorus eternal. Others saw it as torment, proof that the souls could not rest, trapped in endless repetition, calling out to the living who could never join them. Even now, centuries later, the questions persist. Visitors to the region still tell of a town where no birds sing at night, where windows are shuttered before dusk, where the cemetery lies under a canopy of silence until the clock strikes 12. And those who dare to remain swear the hymns still rise, faint but clear, threading through the air like threads of smoke. No one records them. No one investigates. The silence of the outside world endures, just as the silence within the town once did. Theories abound, but resolution never comes. The mystery of Setúbal resists conclusion, just as it resisted explanation in its own time. Perhaps that is its nature, not to be solved, but to remain. A hymn without end, an echo without origin, a story without closure. And so Setúbal lingers in history not as a lesson, nor as a warning, nor even as a tale to be fully believed. It endures as a question, one whispered across generations, one sung in midnight air. What truly happened when the voices began to sing, and why did the world allow silence to answer in their place? The question remains. The silence remains. And above all, the choir remains.